All right, so the webinar's begun and is being recorded. Hi, Donna. See, then I think these folks have probably been patiently waiting.
Great.
Donna.
Hello.
Hi, Donna. I mean,
Hey, everyone.
Kim Savage, Chris. We're just waiting for a couple more folks to join, as well as our committee chair. But I hope you're having a nice afternoon.
It's a beautiful day in the Bay. The sun is out. I mean, after all that rain, it's great weather.
All the smog has been cleared of LA, so we're gonna enjoy that while it lasts.
Hi, Jim.
Hi.
Hi, Jim.
Hi.
Hi, Bonnie. Hi, Eric.
Hello. So, but Bonishe, I think is still, she says that I don't think we can hear her, so I don't think she's been elevated. Oh, there she is.
Hi, Bonnie.
Okay. Goodness.
Oh, wonderful. Hi, everyone.
Hi. Okay, let's see. All right. Well, I think we have everyone who RSVP'd. So, Jim, if you like, we can get started.
Sure.
I can start with the roll call. Actually, we'll start with housekeeping. Danielle, I don't know if you got my last minute request that you might read the housekeeping notes for us. Thank you.
Yep. Welcome, committee members, liaisons, and members of the public to today's LSFTC Homelessness Prevention Committee meeting. Thank you for joining us. We are using Zoom with the goal to foster a more inclusive environment and effective meeting. If you would like to comment during the meeting, please type "I have a comment" or "I have a question" in the chat, and a message will be sent to the host. Alternatively, you can use the raise hand feature. In efforts of transparency for all those joining this public meeting, whether by phone or by Zoom, we request that you refrain from having side conversations in the chat about the content of the meeting. Again, the chat feature is utilized simply as a tool for you to virtually indicate that you would like to speak in order to help the chair facilitate the discussion. All commission and committee meetings will be recorded and posted to the State Bar website. And as a friendly reminder that this is a video conference, and please be aware of your surroundings behind you. Thank you.
Danielle. And then Jim, I'll go ahead and take the roll call. So starting with the chair, Meeker.
Yeah, here.
Aflagi.
Yes, here.
Al-Saraf.
Present.
Iskin.
Here.
Mahoney.
Here.
And then Rhinus let us know that he would probably be unable to attend. Savage.
Here.
And Schreiber.
Here.
All right, Jim, we have a quorum. Oh, and I'll not forget to do the liaisons and the staff this time. So Selena Copeland. Bonnie Huff.
I'm here, thank you.
Christine Ganong. Mark Tony. And then for State Bar staff, Tuan Nguyen.
Here.
Chris McConkey is here. Danielle McRae.
Here.
Brady Dewar. And I see we also have Donna Hershkowitz.
Yes.
And Kim Wormsley. Hi, Donna, and hi, Kim Wormsley. All right, that concludes roll. And then Jim, staff has a report that it would like to give before the calibration discussion begins, but the only other item on the agenda is approval of the meeting minutes from October 1st.
Yep. Does anyone have any changes for the meeting minutes? Can we entertain a motion to approve?
I'll move.
Second.
So Iskin moves, Schreiber seconds.
And Krista, what public comments? I believe we need public comments as well.
Oh, great. Do we want to take public comments before, Jim, the voting on the minutes, or do you want to do it right after?
Can we do the vote since we have the motion? Let's do get the comments later.
All right. So I'll take the vote. Meeker.
Yes.
Aflagi.
Yes.
Al-Saraf.
I'll abstain.
Iskin,
Yes.
Mahoney,
Yes.
Arenas is absent, Savage,
Here. Yes.
and Schreiber. Okay, motion carries. And then thank you, Dawn, for reminding us, public comments comes next on the agenda.
So do we have any public comments?
There's Kimberly Tida, and I'll allow her to talk.
Hi, Kimberly. Thank you for joining us from the Judicial Council.
Absolutely. I'm here for the first hour in place of Melanie, who's on another call. So she will be joining in a little while.
Great. So no public comment then from
No, just want to let you know why I was.
Great. And then I see we also have Zach Newman from the Legal Aid Association of California is also among the attendees. But I don't see any other attendees who would be members of the public who might be wanting to make a comment. Maybe though we can unmute Zach in case Lack would like to make a public comment.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Chris. No public comment at this time.
Great. Thank you for joining us, Zach. Okay, Jim, so no other members of the public at this time.
Okay. So if you want to do your brief summary up front.
Yeah, thank you. So staff just wanted to take a moment at the very beginning to sort of frame the offer staff's proposed framing for today's conversation, what like success, sort of like, the chronology, how we got here, what the goal is, and what staff thinks success could look like for today's discussion. So as a reminder, especially for Tammy, because this is her second meeting and she joined after the full commission delegated authority for scoring and calibration back in August. For Tammy to hear too, in August, the HP Funds Committee recommended to the full commission that to make sure the HP3 competitive grants could go out the door by January 1st on a short timeline this fall, that the commission delegated authority to staff to score in close consultation with the committee. And then what the committee identified close consultation would look like, actually the word close doesn't appear in the resolution, it's just in consultation, but what the committee identified that would look like is having a committee member sit on the staff scoring team. And then staff and that one committee member who was Jim would come back to the full committee on December 2nd, present its scores and sort of justify and explain those scores. The sort of compromise that the committee reached within its own members was that there would be a calibration session. So this is today's conversation to go through a sample of HP3 competitive applications. The committee aspired to calibrate their scoring rubric to 3 to 5 proposals. So staff sent you 5 in case we can actually get to all 5 today. And then staff and Jim, the scoring team, would take today's conversation back with it and have it in mind when it scored all the proposals. So staff proposes that what success looks like for today is not, the goal is not that the committee actually reach a unified score for each of the 5 proposals, or even come to a consensus about each of the rows of the rubric for each of the proposals. Rather, the goal is just to have a really robust, sleeves rolled up conversation about what the rubric means, how the terms are interpreted, where's the line between meets and exceeds, meets and below, what is the scoring team to do with the special consideration row, honing in on those areas where there was the greatest variance in the preliminary scores, and provide the scoring team with as much guidance as possible with which to go back and score all the applications. So success looks like just having a very, very robust conversation that moves the needle, so to speak, on what the rubric means. Jim, would you like to add a different version of what success might look like, or your own nuance?
No, I want to stress again that what we're looking for is input for the scoring committee so that we can reflect the feelings of the commission, or the subcommittee of the commission members' feelings on this, and keeping that in mind, that we're doing this something slightly different than what we've done in other discretionary grants, in that we're delegating the scoring to a staff and subcommittee on these grants, because of the large number and the short time frame. And since I've done this before in some of the other grant committees, instead of trying to hash out each and every scoring category across each of the 5 grants and dragging this through 4 hours, what I thought might be helpful in terms of focusing our conversation is that spreadsheet that Chris sent out earlier, so that we basically have what we scored across the different categories. And we have on that the average score, as well as the standard deviation, which basically shows the level of agreement or lack of agreement, and then the total scores. And then by looking at where we have less agreement, we could focus our discussion on those areas, so that we can sort of find out what are the range of thought that's going into these different scores. And I think what's interesting for me anyways, looking at this, is that there is a lot of agreement among the committee. I mean, if you look at, say, the California CRLA, California Rural Legal Assistance, that there's a lot of agreement in terms of the project impact. There was a lot of agreement in terms of organizational capacity. If you look at the Family Violence Law Center, there was complete agreement across all the scores on the issue of project impact. And there was also pretty unanimous agreement on the focus on rural population, and also on the justice and aging in terms of the project impact. There was a lot of agreement there too. So it's not that there is a consensus, there is a lot of consensus, but there are some differences. So in looking at these grants proposals, what struck me as the one proposal had the most disagreement in terms of the total score, had a variance of 15.13. This was the Impact or Immigrant Legal Resources Center. And with a standard deviation on a total score of 15.3, that means on average, the scores varied by 15 points total. And so I thought that might be a good place to start our conversation in terms of how our different approaches in terms of scoring the impact, the organizational capacity, focus on rural population and the other categories, to see what thoughts were going on and why we came up with such divergent scores.
Yeah, so one thing staff can do, thank you, Jim. And one thing staff can do is we just pulled an excerpt from each of these proposals as quote project abstract. So we can, once we decide which one we're going to start first, so Jim recommends ILRC, staff can just read a few sentences from the project abstract in the program's own words and give you a quick refresher as to which counties they would serve and how much funding they requested. Can I
say something? I'm looking at my score on that, and I was an outlier. And frankly, as I look at this project, I honestly don't know why I scored it so high. So if I'm the cause of the large standard deviation, honestly, I think my score should be knocked down significantly. I don't know. I must have been drunk or something when I did the scoring, because I don't think it merits a 95 at all.
Well, I'm an outlier on the other side, and I guarantee you I was not drinking when I worked on this. I think I was a little harsh, but I have, I can explain why I did not give this a really favorable score. Maybe I was too harsh as I have to look at these other scores, but I do have an explanation for why I did score them the way I did. And I did so very unhappily, but it was based on the analysis of what I read. So I'm happy to talk about it anytime, but I think I agree with Eric that, we're both outliers on this.
And I'm an outlier who could easily be reduced to the 70s or even below. So I apologize for that, but I just see that, and I don't want to cause us to spend hours on this, because I'm not going to not going to stand on my 95 for sure.
Well, yeah, I don't think anybody needs to apologize. I mean, the whole idea of this is to come up with the calibration. But there are some things that were consistent across the different grants. There was different ways of approaching it. For example, partnership is mentioned both in organizational capacity as well as special consideration. And different people approach it different ways. Like for me, that meant the more the partners, the better.
Mhm.
That also meant that I scored higher if the partners were funded as opposed to not funded.
Mhm.
And I tended to score lower if the partners were state bar funded as opposed to not being funded. Now that's my particular biases, but I'd like to have a discussion amongst the committee whether or not we have any sort of consensus on how to approach that issue. I mean, I'm sure other people have different ways of doing it than what I did.
You know, oh, go ahead. Sorry.
I was gonna say, yeah, I had the same approach to Jim, but maybe not the same, like, the special consideration was really hard for me, but I did tend to, if they had a non-IELTS partner that there was money that was given to the partnership, then I tend to give them a more than 5. But I think getting some guidance for the scoring committee, if that's the direction you want to go in terms of not just having a partnership, but funding that partnership, that would be really helpful. Because I did have a hard time in scoring, selecting what number to provide for this special consideration. But I had the same approach as Jim.
Yeah, I thought partners were good, but for all of them which funded the partners, none of them I thought really indicated sort of what they were going to do with the funding. I mean, they did in a general sense, but like they would typically, when they funded the partners, they would give them 20,000 or just some round number they came up with. But I didn't really have a clear idea of what they were going to do with the funding or why they needed the 10,000 or the 20,000. So I just thought that was problematic.
Tammy, I see you raise your hand.
Yeah, so I actually approached it a little bit differently based on conversation, Chris, you and I had prior to me getting into these, and remind the committee here, it's my first time actually going through grants, so appreciate the opportunity. I really looked at it more from like the full representation. You know, when we talked about the evidence-based advocacy strategies, I really did focus on to what extent would these funds be used in the full representation or litigation. And I see on one of mine, it's in the spreadsheet as a 10. I can tell you I didn't score any of them as a 10 because I think all of them across the board provided a range of activities coming out of the funding, whether it be education, you know, all the way up to full representation. So I scored somewhere between, you know, 3 and 9. Actually, I think 3 and 6, because I didn't think any of them had met that criteria, but it could be that I'm misunderstanding that as well.
So that's a great question, because when staff was scoring, we talked about like, well, if they propose full scope representation, which is the one type of intervention for which there's a strong basis in evidence, and partnerships, is that like a 10 out of 10? Or is it, if they just do full scope, do they get a 5 out of 10? Is it, or, you know, and I think for special consideration, it's intending to give folks a little bit of subjective wiggle room and not be a really rigid, like yes or no, 5 points, 5 points. But like to the extent that we can all get on the same page, right? About like, if they do one, but not the other, and they're going to do that one thing really well, is that a 5?
Did any of them propose full scope?
What was that question, Eric?
Did any of them propose full scope litigation? I kind of recall that most of them didn't.
No, it's CRLA, from what I recall, California Rural Legal Assistance. I thought was a full scope representation project.
A couple did. I'll pull up my notes on the side.
But
I think one or two did.
Anyway.
And then Chris, sorry, just for that record, the Disability Rights Legal Center, where I had that scored was actually a 3, not a 10. So I think what happened, it was a drop down, and so my apologies. I was looking at my notes and
that's okay. Easy fix. Okay, I just corrected it on our version that we're looking at. And Christian, you had started to ask a question. I think it was full scope to do what? Was that what it was, the question?
Well, I was just going to echo Eric's comment that I thought there was sort of a lack of detail about how partners were going to be used. And that was just a general critique across the board for me. It was like, we're hiring attorneys. Okay. Frankly, I was kind of frustrated in reading these that I came away from a couple of them not even knowing really how the money was going to be spent differently. So that was sort of something I hope we can get into. But in terms of partnership, I'm thinking of, sort of two categories of partnership. One is a partnership that is going to provide more substantive expertise. And then the second category is a partnership that's going to drive, I guess I would call it demand. And in that category, I would put the aging centers on the justice and aging proposal. They had aging centers in multiple counties that were basically going to be used to send clients to the program. I mean, that to me is like a type of partnership. I actually appreciate that partnership, but it's not a partnership of the kind that, we're going to be working with this other organization to provide, attorneys who are going to litigate or whatever.
Did the committee members find the quarterly activities table was where the applicants were supposed to get detailed about deliverables for both themselves and their partners? Because I think, I can't speak for the other staff's reviewers, but in my experience, the sort of narrative description before the table that was like, just describe your collaborations wasn't very specific as to the sub-grantees' work. But sometimes the quarterly activities table got a little bit more concrete.
I actually didn't think so. Yeah, I thought these proposals all suffered from a lack of a lot of good concrete detail about what the outcomes were going to be, how they were going to achieve them, et cetera, et cetera. So I was kind of frustrated, I have to say, reading these just generally.
And Eric, that could, the scoring team could, if that was the committee's sort of take on the selection of 5 proposals, and the scoring team were to take that to heart, I could see that coming up in project impact and strategies, and then special consideration to the extent that maybe they were missing detail about the partner's role. But did you tend to take that into account for project impact strategies? That sort of
I probably didn't sufficiently, and it wasn't just the partner's role, it was even just the project's role itself. And I don't know, I just thought the outcomes were kind of weak generally. And maybe I was just feeling bitter this week for some reason, but I just wasn't terribly impressed with any of these. Not that they're not doing good work. I think they are, but I just didn't find any of them to be particularly innovative, or I don't know. Anyway, I'll shut up. Stop whining. That was just my reaction.
I'm not sure who raised their hand first, but I see Kim and Chris both.
Yeah.
Oh, Kim took her hand down. So Chris, it's...
Oh, no, I was just following you. I was about to speak.
Oh, please, go ahead.
I wanted to say that one of the primary points in my mind as I read these was whether or not there was a close enough connection to actual housing work. And there were some that required a very big leap of faith, which is why, for example, I have that horribly low score on Immigrant Legal Resource Center. I loved the project. I thought it was a terrific idea and really important. But there was barely the mention of the word housing.
Mm-hmm.
There was no focus on housing, and there was no evidence of experience on the staff to do the work. It may be there, but I didn't see it in the proposal. I really liked the proposal, but I just found that it required a significant leap of faith. It was seemed primarily focused on benefit work with the ultimate goal of leading to housing stability and economic stability. But to me, it wasn't flushed up enough in the proposal. And I wanted to really like it because I thought it was a really, really important proposal to bring in the domestic violence centers and to use their staff. But I just think essentially that the idea needed to be kind of repackaged and strengthened in some way. And one of the reasons I really like Disability Rights Legal Center, not only is it unique in dealing with foster youth who are aging out of the foster care system, which is an incredible need, and LA County was actually pretty out in the front on that. But even though it didn't have specific partnering and just had like an MOU with some other organizations, I just thought the project was incredibly well thought out. And it was a very specific focus, which I've not seen in any of the applications for these additional grants. So that's a little bit of my thinking was just, I'm also now aware, which I wasn't in the past, thinking about the importance of data and reporting back. And so that made it really difficult for me to give a strong score for immigrants' rights, you know, what's going to be able to be reported back for future funding. So
I'm gonna pose a question to the chair and for it to hold, and then after we get through everyone else's raised hands, which is Kim's question makes me wonder as a staff member and future scorer. So where I'm really curious to hear where everyone's lines were from this selection of 5 between meets and exceeds or meets and below for each of these columns. But for in this case, for instance, this Kim started to describe like where her line was between in project impact and strategies, right? She gave an example of like one that she thought fell below and one that she thought was a meet or exceeds. And I'm curious how everyone feels about where those lines are. But I'll turn it, Jim, I pose that question to you, but I think we should go through the hands that are raised.
Okay, well, I just was reacting toward to what Christensen said and what Kim said, that I read most of these partners on most of these grants seem to be a way to feed in clients or a place where they could give trainings to inform people who could possibly use their services, especially amongst those partners who are not state bar funded. To me, I thought that was a legitimate way to extend their outreach. So I didn't have a problem with the fact that the partners were basically sort of inputs or resources for achieving more clients. In terms of the immigration legal rights resource, to me, one of the things that I have problems with that is they talk about legal representation, but they kind of restrict their legal representation on immigration issues, which aren't housing issues, but it is full representation. So I was kind of conflicted to score on that. And I had the exact opposite reaction to Kim between the ILRC and the Foster Youth Advocacy Program, the Disability Rights Center. To me, I found the connection between aging kids that are aging out of the foster care system as a potential housing problem, but it's not like that they were going to homeless kids who've been aged out, but they were trying to approach people who potentially could maybe become homeless, but we don't know. And for me, that seemed kind of a stretch. And it's kind of interesting that Kim thought that was the way to go with that, or far more important than say with the immigration, which I thought reaching out to domestic violence victims, especially domestic violence shelters, was sort of a logical way to do it. But that's why it's important to get this feedback to the scoring committee in terms of these different ways to approach it, because they are different.
Hey, maybe Christian had his hand up next.
Yeah, so I actually agree with both of you on that, which is that I thought that I graded both of them sort of high in those categories. I didn't discount the use of a partner to drive client input or intakes, I think that's fine also. I just was noting before, like, what we mean by partnership is different. We get back to this sort of fundamental question, which I think has plagued us from the beginning, which is it better to sort of, or I guess I should ask it more neutrally, how do we assess bang for the buck? And what does that mean to people? Because, the foster youth, I quite liked that program because to me, it was a discrete population that was sort of subject to measurability. And I also thought it was creative. It's a population with a known homelessness problem as they age out. And so to me, the preemptive work sort of meets the mandate of this funding, which is it's homelessness prevention. That doesn't mean that you go, and you identify a homeless population and house them necessarily. It can mean, how can you target a demographic known for experiencing homelessness and then give them the skills and prevent their homelessness from occurring? And I just felt like, but it does raise this question, that's 4,000 youth. Is that enough? I mean, I compared that to the CRLA program, which frankly is a huge ask, $1.5 million. And I guess I'd just be interested in others' perspective about this, because I think CRLA is an amazing organization, but I truly came away from that application wondering what it was going to be spent on. And I guess I'm, revealing my own bias, which is just that identifying a discrete population and a specific sort of plan to keep them housed is in some ways more attractive than a general sort of approach of sort of doing what you've been doing.
Sorry, I was on mute. I was saying Dwan and Amin have both had their hands raised.
I was going to say on behalf of the staff for the Disability Rights Legal Center project, I think we generally agree, Kim, with what you said in terms of sometimes a nexus with housing might be difficult with some of these projects, but I think we had the opposite kind of reaction with you for that project, in that we thought that maybe some of those cases could lead to homelessness prevention, but we were unclear where the services in all those instances would. So it was a little bit more tenuous for us. We thought that definitely if that was a formula project, it would be qualifying because the statute is broad enough, where for a competitive application, we thought that it should be more squarely obvious that it would lead, every single one of those instances or a vast majority would lead to homelessness prevention, and just was not obvious for us. The client constituency is definitely compelling and worthwhile, and that's where we provided in the focus on underserved a score of 15. But we do struggle also, Chris, with that question of impact. Is a numerical number, how do you versus certain constituencies versus geography? That I think that's a really, really hard one to answer.
This is a good one where the standard deviation is a little higher in project impact strategy. So this might be a good one to figure out how the different committee members interpret exceeds versus meets versus below. Is looking at your LC, four committee members gave it, I think 25 was the highest, exceeds. 2 gave it a meets, and then 1 gave it a below. Staff was kind of divided on this, like Dwan just said. So I'm really curious as to using this one as a case study or any of them, what's the difference between a exceeds, meets, and a below, just looking at these 5 proposals, like DRLCs. That's something, a quick question from staff to the committee, but I mean, you've had your hand up for so long.
No, not at all. I want to sort of jump in a little bit and I had a similar reaction to Eric's as a whole on these projects. I felt like, I mean, to be honest, and I think this sort of came across in the way the scoring went down. I felt like the projects that I thought were strong. In fact, I think almost all of them, there was something about them that sort of, the ultimate score didn't quite match up with the greatness of the project. And that was either because they didn't serve rural communities, that dropped them down by 10 automatically, which puts them in a lower bracket, or, you know, there are other issues that sort of like, you know, there wasn't a perfect one in this group. And maybe that's because these are, you know, of the batch of applications that we're looking at, these are maybe shading towards the middle or back of the pack. But I thought, you know, one of the things that I was sort of thinking through as we were going through this, and I know this is a focus of ours and a focus of the money, is on work that is sort of beyond the scope of what is already done by these programs, or beyond the scope of what's already sort of, you know, addressed in formula funding or otherwise. And I think some of them were, there was some ingenuity there, and I appreciated, for example, DRLC. You know, what I don't want to do, and this is something that I think would be helpful to get feedback from staff on, is, you know, where the description of the nexus by the programs is lacking. Is that because of a failure of the grant drafting process, or is that a failure of the program? And I think, you know, DRLC, I think they did a little bit better of a job of describing the nexus. I thought they did a good job, and that's why I scored them 25 on the project impact and strategies, just to kind of address the case study point. I thought, you know, they described a unique, underserved, particularly underserved community, what the problem was, and what they can do to prevent. And I agree. I think, you know, as many steps back as we can go without losing sight of what the ultimate goal is, but as many steps back from homelessness as we can go to prevent it, I think is a valuable use of this funding, if we can still kind of keep that connection. The question I have is on the ILRC program. Is it possible that there is a more of a nexus than they are describing? I mean, like I saw the same thing, like everything was related to immigration. There were a lot of things that were, you know, around housing. But maybe we can go back and maybe get some more information, or I don't know what it is, or get some feedback from folks who have maybe more knowledge about this. But I can see a world in which that actually would affect housing, but they just haven't articulated it well. So that's sort of my open-ended question.
Just to jump in and answer a question that you asked to staff, which was like, was it communicated to programs to make an explicit, to be explicit about the connection to homelessness prevention? And it was, staff communicated that in the webinars, and then I think on the application form itself, near the top when it was saying, staff copy and pasted the language from the from AB 164 that said what was allowed, and said make an explicit argument for like where you fall in that list of activities that's permitted. So I think most folks did that, but some of them were more clear about how it was homelessness prevention than others.
Chris, if I could just jump in for a second. If we're looking at Disability Legal Rights Center, I'm the low score on that. And I'm convinced that if one of the things that's important for a committee, if an agency identifies a population that's unique and is at potential for becoming homeless like that, that's a valuable thing to look at. And I would easily score that as a 20, which would bring the variance or standard deviation way down. I think most of the group was pretty consistent in terms of organizational capacity. Most people scored it as a 15. I think we have agreement there. Focus on rural population, although they mentioned 2 counties that have some rural areas, they didn't mention anything about outreach. And it seems like there's a general consensus that should have been a 5, which doesn't quite meet, but it does address the issue. If you look at the focus on underserved, I think the committee's pretty consistent. And again, I'm one of 2 lower scores at 10. I could see with the change of definition of the impact that I could easily score that as a 15. So that really reduces the variability there. Where we come into project evaluation, I scored it as a little bit higher because of the annual reviews, that they're going to look at annual evaluation of outcomes and internal reviews with feedback. But again, I noted that there was no budgeting on that. And on special considerations, I really come out low on that because I didn't see any advocacy as far as full representation, and I didn't see any partners. And so I would be interested in input from the rest of the committee, why they scored that as a non-zero.
Remind us what the special consideration is again, Jim. What were the elements of that? Was it just partnership or was it more than that?
It was partnerships and it was advocacy, full representation.
So they didn't, for staff, they didn't identify any partners, but they did describe some full scope representation. So staff came in at 3 for that one. I'd be interested to hear, like, Kim, you know, what Kim went 9 on it.
You know, that special consideration category seems fairly undefined. I mean, I guess I took it as, I think some of that is really kind of innovation. So I kind of gave them extra points for innovation, having read so many of these proposals and they being not innovative and not really specific in terms of assisting a group typically unrepresented. So I think I really erred on that side and not on the partnership. They didn't have specific partners, but they are entering into MOUs with other organizations. So I took that as having some value also. You know, I may have, you know, overrated that just by my general positive view of the proposal.
You know, I think I may have done the same thing. I think I injected a piece of innovation into that. I don't know whether it's there or not. Can you actually read the text of special consideration? Somebody have that?
Yeah, Chris, I can read it. I just dropped it in the chat. So for special consideration on the rubric, it says applicant articulates a focus on partnerships and evidence-based advocacy strategies to address individual or systemic homelessness.
So that's a little bit vague to me. I mean, I think that could bring in more than just full scope representation in my mind. You know, just you're doing something interesting that could be evidence-based. I don't know. So I think I did more or less what Kim did. And by the way, I agree with the observations that Kim made. I like this project. I mean, to the extent that I liked any of them, I like this project the most, because I was sold on the idea that aging out foster youth with disabilities would be a group that would be particularly at risk for homelessness. So you didn't have to sell me on that. So I thought this was a good one. Can I make an observation though about project impact? Was anybody else concerned about the specific deliverables and the number of people that each one of these projects indicated that would be that they would serve? Like even for this one that I liked, I mean, I had written down in my notes, and this may not be totally accurate, but like they were going to shoot for 25, you know, cases in year 1, 60 in year 2, 100 in year 3. I wasn't sure if that was 100 total over year 3 or just 100 in year 3. But even if it's the latter, I know just those numbers seemed awfully low to me. And across the board, the numbers seemed low. And that's part of what's driving some of the comments I'm making here today.
I agreed. I agree with you. I had the same feeling.
So this is great because staff is taking notes about like where people differentiated between exceeds, meets, and below in each of these categories. So on this question, number of clients served, impact, it obviously goes to impact. So, for DRLC, for instance, Eric, it looks like you still gave it the highest possible score. So is your thinking that maybe, while numbers matter, client numbers matter, there's still something about this that was like the need was so great that overrode the need for more clients?
I guess my attitude was, if I didn't particularly love any of these, but if we're going to comparatively rate them, I guess I thought this was the best of the 5. That was kind of my attitude. But I kind of wondered across the board why all these shouldn't just apply for formula grants, and why we're even looking at these as a competitive RFP, innovative kind of things. I don't know. Anyway, that's my answer for why I gave it the relative rating.
So the latter of what, excuse me for jumping in, but the latter of what Eric just raised is whether or not something really is basically a formula grant activity is something I feel like I would like to discuss and hear what the staff has to say, because my notes for CRLAs is why isn't this a formula grant?
Yeah.
It looks like this is precisely what they do. And I can't understand if it's anything different than that, because they kept throwing around the terms wraparound and holistic services, which are the new buzzwords. But I didn't know what they were going to do beyond what I think I know they already do. So I don't know where we draw the line on that, but it's just something I thought we should talk about.
I agree.
And then Jim and Dwan, you both had your hands up. Sorry, I can't remember who raised it first.
Yeah, well, I just want to say that one of the things when we looked at the number of people impacted, for me, I always try to factor that into the project impact. So I agree with Eric that at least the disability rights, where they said that 25 use first year, 60 use the second, and 100 use the third year. Although they did say that they wanted to produce 1,000 hours of pro bono attorney assistance, although they weren't clear, was that 1,000 total over 3 years or 1,000 a year. But that was one of the reasons why I gave it a 15 in terms of impact, where the lowest numbers. And in general, where people had low numbers, I tended to put that in the impact category as opposed to one of the other categories. And I'd like to know if there's any consistent feeling in terms of that. And on the issue of formula grants, I thought that people like the CLRA, that even though they have a formula grant, I thought that if they were going to get these funds, they had to show that this was going to be service over and above what they do with the formula grant. And for them, I thought they did say that they were going to do an extra 300 cases per year, servicing an extra 1,000 household members. And they did say that they were going to do 150 full representation to benefit clients in terms of the housing area. So I thought that's the reason why I gave them an impact score a little bit higher. And I thought that was okay for these grant proposals, that this was supposed to be stuff over and above what they do with the formula grant, but maybe I was reading too much into that.
And Dwan, I think you were next.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask a follow-up question to Kim and Eric, because I heard you both use the word innovation for the special consideration. Can you help me understand where you drew that from in terms of why reading innovation? I might have missed something in that category.
Oh, I drew it from probably my own imagination.
Kim used also the same word. So was it?
Well, because I thought these were supposed to be something different and special and different than the formula grants. So to me, that means unusual, unique, innovative. That's kind of the way I think about this RFP. Or otherwise, why not just put yourself into the formula grant?
So I don't think for the staff, we read for at least a special consideration, innovation into that. It really for us was limited to partnerships and evidence-based advocacy. And for the evidence-based advocacy, we really based it on Kelly's kind of presentation and consultation with Bonnie, that the majority of the time it is full scope of representation. And so they were providing the full scope representation. And in this instance with DRLC, they did have some of that full scope. That's why we gave them a 3. And so I am struggling to see where, even if it's not in special consideration, where it would be, where we would inject innovation into our scoring.
Well, I mean, I think that's an error on my part, but I would say that in the future, I think we should think about how we want to define special considerations. I think in a previous grant application, it was much broader, and I don't think we limited to those 2 points. I may be wrong, but I think it's something that in the future we might want to think about a little bit more.
Yeah, you're right, Kim, in that this special consideration category is more narrow than what we have had in the past.
Okay.
Would it be, what about putting innovation in terms of the project impact and strategies? Because innovation really does go to the strategy, and they're proposing to do something different than your typical grant.
So I just want to jump in, and now that I'm hearing everyone talk about it, there was it was in the memo that accompanied the scoring rubric in August that innovation was in the rubric for HP2, and then the memo explained it was removed for HP3, in part because of feedback from the committee, like a debrief on how the HP2 rubric worked. And there was staff reviewed the recording and reread the minutes and saw that people struggled with innovation because they thought it was disadvantaging projects that were, quote, tried and true, like interventions that that we know work. And the federal government came in and said, for these dollars, we really want evidence-based, like basis in like tried and true strategies, like evidence supports it because we know it works. So it was almost like you couldn't do both. It was like one or the other. So that the rubric switched from an emphasis on like, let's try something new to like, let's honor the federal government's preference and give preference to things that we know work. That's like a historical record. That was just my reminding you.
Right, and I can acknowledge that when we had those discussions, because Christian and I had quite a few conversations about innovation, and I told him I thought he was being unrealistic. The programs were just overwhelmed and don't expect innovation, and he was much more optimistic than me. And so I think maybe that's why we took out that word. And I realized I didn't quite follow the rules, but I wanted to give applicants who I thought were proposing something innovative a bump up. So, and that was sort of my thought process. Now I see I kind of didn't follow the rules this time around.
And then Tammy, and then it was Donna.
Okay, if it's okay, I'll go back to the Disability Rights Legal Center, and I scored kind of right in the middle of everybody. So Eric, definitely see the benefits that you discussed on this program, but also recognize the same thing Jim did, where when you look at the actual numbers, it just seemed low. And so meet expectations seemed, and that's why I went with that one. On the Immigrant Legal Resource Center, Kim, you mentioned part of the reason for scoring low on that was that there wasn't a real connection between like homelessness prevention. And the way I read kind of the statute there was around part of this could be the funds could go towards ensuring receipt of eligible benefits to improve housing. So I did take that kind of literal of, yes, most of that advocacy was around, benefits, but ultimately would result in preventing homelessness. So just took a little bit different view of that one.
Thank you, Tammy. Donna?
Yeah, so I've been listening to the conversation on innovation and whether the proposal needed to be something new and different. And I think that, over the years, one of the things that we've talked about, certainly at a staff level, and I want to be clear, I did not review any of these proposals, but one of the things we talked about at a staff level is, it may be for the formula for the formula grant, you are proposing a project that is extending to, and I'm just going to make something random up, but it's extending to seniors age 70 and older. And if you had additional money, then you could take it to seniors age 65 and older. But you, with only the formula grant money, you wouldn't have the ability to do that. And so it was a way to expand the project. It wasn't supplanting existing resources because it was still something that you were not able to fund absent the new competitive grant proposal. So it wasn't only sort of unique and innovative and looking at things from a different perspective. That's certainly always exciting to see. But it also encompassed in our minds the thought that this is an important project that you can't fund otherwise, and the formula grant funding isn't enough to cover sort of the whole panoply of clients that you would serve, and this would give you another angle into that. So just wanted to add those additional thoughts.
Are they able to sub-grant on the formula grants?
I missed the start of your question, Eric. Would you say that again?
I'm just curious, could the project sub-grant, in other words, use partners with their formula grant money?
Oh, they could for
Yes.
HP3. They could. I don't actually remember seeing very many, if any, subgrants on the formula grant applications, but they were allowed to propose that. So I'm just kind of, from time to time, I'll jump in and just say like what I'm putting in my notes, what I'm hearing, so that the committee can push back if staff isn't getting it right. Is one thing I'm kind of hearing is that for project impact and strategies, I'm hearing maybe a consensus that for an exceeds 25, it needs to be more than just a formula, quote, formula grant project. It needs to strive for a little bit more because this is a competitive grant. And that doesn't have to necessarily mean impact more people, but it could look like an impressive number of clients, or the intervention is particularly compelling, such as with DRLC's focus on foster youth with disabilities. Like that's such a unique community. So that's something I've noted for myself, and Daniel and Dwan are kind of taking their own notes, I think, but that's just what I've heard for like, that might be the difference between a meets and an exceeds. Something else I've heard, and I don't know if we want to go column by column because we've been sort of jumping around, but I've heard in focus on rural that the below versus rather than a meets would be maybe they just mention that they will serve clients from rural counties, or they list rural counties, but they don't describe how they're going to do any outreach to rural counties, or go beyond merely sort of just saying what the locations will be. That would be, I've heard that would be a below from at least one committee member. Okay, I'm just saying it out loud so people can say like, that doesn't sound right, so you can correct me. But this is the sorts of notes that we're taking.
I think that sounds right to me.
Jim, I'm going to follow your lead, but do you want to switch to org capacity? Because we can always come back to impact and strategies. Or do you want to continue with impact and strategies?
No, I think you summarized it pretty well. I mean, I think that category could be read to include especially innovation, especially to get the exceed level. Work capacity people, there wasn't a whole lot of disagreements generally in that, except for the again, the Immigration Legal Resources Center. And I think we've been discussing why people were a little different on that one. I mean, three of us scored that as a 20, and one of us scored it as a 10, and a couple as a 15. I scored it as a 15 is just sort of equaling, because it seemed to me that they were doing stuff that they were well qualified to do, but they weren't really reaching outside their normal bound. I mean, how about the people who scored 20 exceeds? Can we get some input on why it should be an exceeds?
So it looks like that's Mean, Christian, and Eric. like ILRC's organizational capacity?
Well, I mean, I think, maybe this isn't right. I mean, they know what they're doing in immigration law. That's kind of how I interpreted organizational capacity. They're well experienced. They know what they're doing. Whether or not this particular project is great, they know what they're doing. They're good. They got the right people. They can handle the work. That's kind of what it's worth. That was probably my thinking on that dimension.
I had the same view, and I guess as a general matter, I would say organizational capacity. I think I generally gave everybody 15 or 20 on that. If I gave 15 instead of 20, I probably didn't feel that strongly, but it was my thinking was that a particular program that required additional staff or hiring was going to be maybe more difficult. Like, in other words, do they have the capacity now? Do they have the expertise now? Are they trying to develop the expertise? That was sort of my thinking, but I wasn't sort of wedded to that particular.
I had sort of a similar view across the board. I think I went with 15 and 20. I mean, this is something that we've talked about a lot. I think, in my view, I sort of defer if the staff or others have more specific information about the capacity of these organizations, then I sort of defer to that. So consider my scoring on all the org capacities as a soft score, because if presented with other information, and it's kind of hard to tell from their affirmative grants whether there are weaknesses or other things, or things that haven't come across our view. The reason that I did 15 or 20 is because I think for some of them, one lens what Christian was saying, where they have a particular knowledge and a particular expertise, I felt a little bit more comfortable giving them more, given what the scope of the project was and how that fit. Those two things sort of fit hand in hand. But again, I'm open to persuasion.
I think that for the staff perspective, for this organization capacity, if they had like the substantive knowledge, we landed on 15. If it was a new area of law for them, or they were doing it for the first time, or if they had a compliance issue, or if they have an issue of turning things late, or a governance issue, then it would go down to a 15. Though that's, in our experience, not many programs would get a 15. And then if they would get a 25, is if they had a proven track record in already doing this, they have already piloted it, say, and it was successful, then they would go up to 25. But I think from our experience, usually the staff is the one that scores the organizational capacity. The majority is in the 15 range for us. I don't know if you feel comfortable with that. We can also, it seems like Amin and Chris, you used like 20 as kind of the benchmark. We use the 15. I mean, since the scoring team is 3 staff and 1 gym, we can switch it to that 20. I think it kind of equalizes because we're reading the whole set, but that's how we've approached it, the staff. And most of ours are 15.
I think a 20 there is exceeds, right? So a 15 puts it at meet.
15 is meets, yeah.
Yeah, and that's why we are generally in the 15, unless, again, there's a compliance issue, new area of law, then we would drop it to a lower.
10.
If it's particularly compelling for whatever reason, then a 25, but we landed
a 20.
Sorry, 20. Yeah.
Are there any characteristics that would flag a 10?
Yeah, or a 20. I guess I'm not following that. What gets 20?
A 20 is, and I can't recall from the last one, but we gave very few 20 from the last time we did the HP grants, but something of particularly noteworthy. So say, not only were they an expert in this area, they've been doing housing for 15, 20 years, but maybe in the last HP grant, they already had piloted this, and now they're bringing there was some track record of success from this organization for this type of grant funding, not just substantive expertise.
And how about a 10? What would I have to
10
do to
is
get
if
a
they had a
10?
compliance issue that maybe showed that their organization wasn't, we might not feel confident that they would be successful with launching a new project. So we go back and review monitoring visit letters and see if there's any compliance governance issues. If it was a new area of law that they're embarking on. I think there was one program I recall last year that they had never done housing law before, but they were going to hire, if they received the grant funding, they would hire a new grant. So it didn't give us a lot of confidence. Not that they couldn't do it, but there just wasn't that track record of success. So that we gave them a 10 in that instance. Or whatever the corollary to 10 is. I can't remember in the last scoring rubric if organizational capacity was out of 20.
So my 10, I didn't have this knowledge, but my 10, before we were really started talking, I could see raising it up. I think on all of the others grant applications that I reviewed, I think I gave 20, and I had a hard time figuring out what to put on this because they're supposed to be working on housing issues ultimately, and I didn't see any evidence of that. I have no doubt that their capacity to do immigration work is excellent. So I was really thrown off by this. So I mean, that score of mine is certainly off, but that was sort of my my concern was I didn't have any evidence of them really doing housing work, and I look at this as essentially what this grant should lead up to. I understand the language in the legislation, but I'm also thinking ahead about the legislators understanding how this money is used, and they view it primarily as housing. And then, so when they see a grant that might require a leap of faith, I'm concerned that they may not take that leap.
Danielle, did you want to respond for staff?
Sure. I just wanted to point out that the description on the rubric for organizational capacity also mentions partners, and was actually wanting to get the commission or committee's feedback on how, if at all, that played a role in how they scored organizational capacity. I'm happy to read that description out if that's helpful. On the rubric, it says the applicant demonstrates that it has the qualifications, experience, resources, and/or partners that it needs to meet the proposal objectives.
And that was, I remember that was actually built into the resolution on August 31st. The committee decided to put it in both capacity and special consideration, itemized in both. In part, and the genesis of that was that the legislature had come back right on the eve of that meeting in late August and said, we really, really, really want to see partnerships. And so the committee was taking that to heart and trying to figure out where it could slot it into the rubric, and wanted to do it in those two places. But how we apply that now is the open question.
Well, that also brings in the question, do we want to differentiate between partners who are state bar funded versus those who aren't, and partners that have funding versus those that don't?
I'll just say staff didn't differentiate, or did we? I didn't. I don't remember Danielle or Dwan saying that they differentiated either, but that's not necessarily the correct answer.
We didn't differentiate, but we did give more points if they actually funded that partnership. There was there was money in the line item.
I think Danielle's point is a good one. And also, like for the Immigrant Legal Resource Center, Kim, you focus on housing, but isn't the gist of this program that they were going to provide immigration services that would be a segue into the client getting a status, and then once they got the status, they would be less amenable to homelessness, or they'd be more able to get benefits. So in other words, the focus of the work was really immigration work, right? I think for the most part. And if that's the focus, then why wouldn't a strong expertise in immigration law merit a 20, particularly if they have partners who are well experienced in immigration things?
No, I mean, I agree. That's what I was saying, that, I mean, I had a hard time figuring out what to even do with this entire proposal, despite the fact that I liked it. I just felt it was just
Can I ask a
I
question?
wanted them to articulate much more how this work was going to lead to housing and not
Mhm.
just have us assume
Yeah.
that that's what would happen. Like I said, I really like the concept of it and wanted to feel stronger about it.
Wanted it to fall within bounds. Well, so there's a question I guess I'll pose on behalf of staff, which is that's really important to how we interpret the rubric. Is so the funding statute AB 164, it lists like here's what's allowed, and one of the things it says is like essentially what's income maintenance work, help them apply for benefits to which they're entitled, and another one was domestic violence, like housing work with domestic violence victims. And ILRC kind of describes that too. So my question for everybody is, to what extent should the scoring team look for an explicit argument that the income maintenance work, the domestic violence work, et cetera, will help prevent homelessness, versus just say, okay, well, I see it's listed in the statute, let's go ahead and assume that it's in bounds. And might that be the difference between a meets and an exceeds? Is
For
it how
project, for project impact?
for project impact? Yeah. Like, I guess that would be most relevant. Yeah, for project impact. I see Bonnie immediately raised her hand, so maybe Bonnie wants to just opine on that.
Well, yeah, I just also want to recognize that these numbers, this data will all be reviewed by the feds and in relationship to housing. So I think that would be the other kind of thing that we just want to make sure that that we feel that we can be, totally justify this as related to eviction and to homelessness prevention.
Does that sound like something that would be help distinguish a meets from an exceeds? Is that the applicant explain really convincingly how the work is homelessness prevention work? I suppose if it isn't obviously like eviction defense or something, but something like this, like ILRC's proposal, or would that be the difference between a below and a meets? Stumped everyone with that one.
Can you say that again? Since
Yeah, so one thing that I'm hearing the committee talk about right now is how important is it that the applicant explicitly address how the proposed intervention is homelessness prevention. Like, so if it's income maintenance work, like public benefits work, or maybe family law work, because ILRC also talked about family law work. If it's not facially obvious how it's homelessness prevention, how important is it that they make that argument in their proposal? Like, because it sounds like maybe Kim, like that was important. It sounds like maybe that was important to her. And would that be the difference between like a below and a meets, is if they don't really explain it?
I think they should. And by the way, I also think they should explicitly address why this project cannot be covered by a formula grant. At least that would help me.
Yeah, that one might be a little harder because the applications are all in now, so they don't have an opportunity to address that one. But the instructions and the application questions did ask them to explicitly talk about, and the webinars, we made sure to tell them, make sure you explain how it's homelessness prevention works. I feel like that one was communicated. The second one, I'm not sure was actually communicated.
But homelessness prevention is also addressed by the formula grant, so that doesn't differentiate between the two.
I was just gonna say, it's hard to get that information, but they do have to attest that it's not supplanting. So if they're already receiving a formula grant, they can't then get more funding to do exactly that same work if they've already have funding for that. So I don't know if that helps.
If we've stated in the grant application that the applicant needs to expressly explain how their proposal addresses homelessness issues, then if they don't do that, is it falling below the basic expectation? I mean, I get the leap. I'm concerned about other people who are providing us funding not getting the leap. I get it. So, I may come across as being just really a stickler on this, but that's what I'm concerned about. I'm not concerned about any of us understanding it. I'm concerned about people outside of this world who are providing funding and want some evidence of how many people did you prevent from going onto the street? How many, tenancies did you preserve? How many people did you get into housing from the street? That's the kind of numbers I think the state legislature wants to see. I may be wrong. So
staff will pull the RFP and the application questions just to make sure, and we can let you know exactly how it was worded for them. They'll just take us a moment to pull those.
So I guess what I felt like, if it was, I have no objection to the more explicit, to wanting something more explicit, but I guess, thinking about identifying, and I'm thinking of the foster youth example, identifying the statistics surrounding that particular community of people and the risk of homelessness or the incidence of homelessness in that particular group, to me, then it's implicit, if not explicit. Whereas I found like the recitation of statistics in other applications to be sort of platitudinal.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, who? It's not like if you just, and I hate to pick on CRLA on this, but I felt like identifying statistics in various counties to be sort of not as useful when the project doesn't really speak, in my mind, to a particular initiative.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know. I didn't feel like I needed an express tie to homelessness with the foster youth, because it was sort of like, yeah, this is a really vulnerable population. We're going to try to get at them as they're aging out in order to prevent the homelessness that is endemic to this community of people. And that's a lot different than just saying, hey, we operate in these counties where homelessness is a huge problem.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I haven't pulled up the application yet, but I pulled up the RFP first, because the RFP was the official policy, so to speak, adopted by the committee and then handed to programs and said, this is the standard you're being asked to write to and communicate it to them. So the RFP and the review guide define project impact and strategies in this way. It does ask them to explain homelessness. So it says applicants should explain how the project's strategies and goals, that is its activities, partnerships, outputs, outcomes, etc., will directly and significantly ameliorate homelessness. They should explain why they selected the particular interventions over others. The justification for the proposed services should refer to the circumstances and needs of particular populations that the project seeks to serve. So that first sentence, directly and significantly ameliorate homelessness. It asks for such a description. So it would be within bounds, I think, for that to be like a factor between a meets and a below and a meets, or meets and exceeds. Like that would be, it wouldn't be something that like was not communicated, I think was Kim's question.
Right, but then I guess like, I don't know. I mean, if you're doing tenancy, like if you're doing eviction defense work, that seems like I mean, saying we're doing eviction defense work is a 20 then. It's like it's a perfect score because it's like obvious that what you're doing is doing the work. I don't know. It seems like kind of an odd differentiator to me, but.
Oh, I suppose staff was proposing it would be like one factor among others. So maybe you'd still look at like, will it serve enough people? You can still look at other like measures of impact.
You know, when I look at the Immigrant Legal Resource Center, I think in a sense, the way the project is proposed, it's pretty unique in not making the connection. They're not making a more explicit connection to housing work. I don't think we typically see that. And I mean, I agree with Chris. I mean, I'm not interested in a page full of numbers. I had the same reaction as him, but I'm looking more for a conceptual kind of statement about how the work will lead to greater stability and housing opportunity.
But that's interesting because I kind of read it like Eric and Tammy in that they were saying they're primarily interested in helping with the immigrated status that would be a springboard for them getting government benefits that would increase housing stability.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's funny. I hear what you're saying, Kim, but I could actually wrap my head more around the connection that was being made by the Immigrant Legal Resource Center than I could with CRLA. I agree with Chris's reaction to that. It was just a lot of numbers, that just kind of kept repeating themselves and just was very generic and it was kind of unsatisfactory to me.
Well, on that issue, though, I mean, I thought, and perhaps staff can enlighten us on this, if they were targeting the same group that they normally target with their formula grant, but they're proposing to cover more people, X number of extra cases, is that not legit? Because they clearly made the argument that they're going to do an extra 300 cases per year, affecting an estimated 1,000 household members, that they were going to have 3 extra attorneys to give an additional 154 representations. So that was extra work. Is that not sufficient for the grant proposal?
We thought it was, but I might be hearing that the committee members don't, but I think the staff perspective is that that's sufficient. It's not supplanting. This is in addition to their formula.
Yeah, but if you actually looked at those numbers carefully, they talked about 300 cases per year, 150 of them beyond simple advice. So
right.
half of them were going to be like maybe one session of advice or something. 150 beyond advice, whatever that means. I don't even know if they're doing full scope representation. And 85 positive outcomes in 85 or so cases. That didn't seem like a very compelling number to me for the amount of money that they're asking for.
So I think when Jim, we met with the story team, us and Jim, we did decide to bifurcate the budget piece with whether they should be funded, because separately we did take a look at the budget and we did think that it was the ask was very rich. So I think we are in agreement with you, but we thought the approach would be, and let us know, this committee, if you agree with this, is to look at the scores, rank them absent of that budget cut. And if they then are worthy of being funded, we will come up with a suggested proposed amount. And then with that, we'll take a consideration. We'll look at the budget narrative, what the FTE is, and all that. But because we did think that it was a lot for what they were proposing.
So Jim, I don't know if you want to stay on impact and strategies, or if you want to close out org capacity.
Well, yeah.
We're doing fine on time, but it's up to you if you want to.
Sure. maybe we should go to one of the other categories. One we haven't really discussed much is the focused on rural population, the differences in score, because there does seem to be a bit of variability across the different scores and the grants, with the exception of the disability rights legal center. I mean, there was complete unanimity in terms of how we scored that, but on the other grants, there are some big differences.
What's one where, let's see, sorry for all the scrolling. I'm just seeing where they're, yeah, so it's DRLC got 5s all the way down. And my suspicion is that was because they list rural counties, but they don't really talk about it. They're targeting rural in any other way. CRLA, this one actually had the whole spectrum, 5, 10s, and 15s. And that's kind of ironic because CRLA serves only, well, their mission is to serve only rural communities. So I don't know if we want to maybe use them as our case study.
Sure.
Well, so for staff notes so far, all I have is, and Dwan and Dan have notes too, but what I have is just that if they just list, if they check the boxes for rural counties, or maybe just list the rural counties in the narrative, that would get them at least a below. They wouldn't get a not addressed. The only way you'd get not addressed would be if they said, no, we're just not going to focus on rural at all, which a few did. But the difference between a meets and exceeds is still, that's still fuzzy for me as a staff member.
Yeah, I scored it as exceeds because not only, well, one is the organization's reputation, but they also had field offices located in the counties that they listed, which is more than some of the others did as far as addressing rural needs, that they didn't necessarily have offices in those areas, whereas CLRA did.
I just, in case you're interested, of the 34 proposals, 23 checked the box. Will this project focus on rural communities? And the other 11 did not. And indeed, the other 11 tended to select counties that was like LA, Alameda, that sort of thing. So, Tammy.
Yeah, this was the first one I looked at, and Chris actually talked to you a little bit about this one too, with where I was getting stuck on rural. Even though it seems to be their focus, I don't have the benefit that most of you do in terms of this organization. Again, first time looking at it. But where I kind of got stuck was their reference to substantial rural. And then when they started putting out percentages and they were saying it's 12% in San Luis Obispo or 17 in Santa Cruz, to me in my head, I just didn't think that was substantial. That's why I went below, but I could see now looking at their proposal and having the benefit of looking at 4 others where it could be more at a meet, at a 10, which is meet.
Like Tammy, I focused on the fact that there were only 2 counties in which they gave actual percentages of rural, and they were 12 and 17%, like she said. And so I wasn't really sure. I mean, we know they do, you know, work up and down the valley, but and that is their focus, but it wasn't quite clear to me what they were, you know, what they were going to address.
I mean, your hand was up for a moment, but
Yeah, I had a similar view. 17 and 12 didn't really jump out at me as a focus on rural, and I think, you know, they're targeting these counties, but they're not. I didn't really get a sense that they had articulated how they were targeting rural communities within those counties. So that's why I ended up at 5. I think they're obviously they're contemplating that maybe some folks from rural communities will be assisted, but I didn't get the sense that they had articulated that they're focusing on that.
Perhaps my fault in rating him as 15 is I was bringing in other information. I was relying on the Access to Justice Commission report on rural and housing issues, where they actually divide up the counties in the state according to whether or not they're completely rural, or they're a rural urban mix, or an urban rural mix, meaning that they got more urban poor than rural, or an urban county. And the counties they mentioned, Ventura, Santa Barbara, San Luis Obispo, and Monterey, all of those are rural urban counties mixed, it's classified by the commission, which means they have substantial rural poor. The one, Santa Cruz, is an urban rural, which means they've got more urban poor than rural poor. But that was only one of the other three were all primarily rural over urban poor. So that's why I rated them. Now, they didn't make that argument. They only cited statistics for some of the counties that they used. But maybe I was bringing in outside information I shouldn't have.
I'm thinking for staff for this one, we did meet expectations. Danielle, Dwan, do you happen to remember off the top of your heads why this wasn't an exceeds for us?
On the rural?
For CRLA, yeah.
Yeah.
We landed in the middle.
Yeah, we thought that they didn't give a very detailed strategy on, and this is where like we struggled with how much do we know about bringing in from the outside. So that is a good question for the committee, because we all know CRLA does work in rural and they're the main provider there. But they're what they wrote for the outreach strategy was a little bit lacking, and I think that's why we gave them a 10. But I hear Jim's point about the field office. So, I mean, I think we could go to 15 also. And if the committee is amenable to us bringing that outside knowledge into kind of the review.
I'm amenable. It's literally in their name.
Yeah, I know. Yeah.
I am as well.
Okay.
Yeah, I suppose for me, I agree with what John just said, because that represents staff's position. And for me, oftentimes the difference between meets and exceeds was just how detailed they got and how persuasive their explanation was. Like, I didn't want them to force me to like have to give them the benefit of the doubt. I thought in a competitive process they should make the case. So for me, that would be the thing. It's just like Dwan said, it was kind of a short explanation, and like I think maybe that could have been an exceeds for CRLA on this one, but I didn't want to have to be unfairly like read into something they didn't write when I wasn't doing that for everyone else. Rural was actually, I think, when I was scanning the spreadsheet earlier, it's the column that seemed to be the most consensus. There was one family violence law center, Jim. Everyone, I think, gave it a 0, probably because they actually answered the question no. They're not going to focus on rural. So I don't know, Kim, you saw something special there you wanted to mention.
I have no memory, so it could be an error.
That's all right. Jim, was there any other ones that you thought would be a good case study for rural?
Well, the ILRC, the Immigrant Legal Resources, I mean, we have a lot of variability with a standard deviation of 3.9. I mean, we have 2 people giving it 10. We have 4 people giving it 15 and 1 person giving it a 5. So that's a lot of variability.
And since we keep coming back to ILRC, would it be helpful for me to read? I pulled the project abstract. I can read the first like 3 sentences of it. I don't know if a couple folks were trying to remember exactly what they were proposing. Would that be helpful, or would that be unhelpful?
Sure. Why don't you?
Okay, I was gonna say, all right.
Sure.
So I mean, just as a refresher, since this was also the one that Jim suggested we use as like the main case study that we keep coming back to. Their first, this is their own words. This is the first couple sentences. The project will fortify the economic stability of immigrant survivors of domestic violence in the rural region of the San Joaquin Valley by facilitating their access to lawful immigration status, employment authorization, and public benefits. So it's survivors of DV, immigration, and public benefits work. It'll establish key partnerships between domestic violence shelters and immigration legal services providers in 2 regions of the San Joaquin Valley. And then the abstract goes on, but that's the first 2 sentences of it.
And again, maybe I was bringing in outside information, but I do know that the rural poor to San Joaquin Valley is some of the highest concentration of poor in the state. So, I mean, you know, you got places like Fresno that's got more rural poor than any other county in the state, even though it has a lot of urban poor.
I think for me, without knowing, the demographics of the geography of these counties, it's hard for me to give an exceed in some of these where they make reference to rural, and it seems, that they support that. I mean, I could look up San Joaquin and see, but I felt safer just saying meet expectations because it wasn't really, I don't know the county enough. And then I wasn't able to, where many of them did say they would serve rural, but they also said that they would serve some urban as well. So I was always on the fence on some of these because most of them did say urban as well. In this case, I think they just said rural, but again, I couldn't substantiate it. So I kind of played the safe route on that one.
Well, are people comfortable if we bring in outside information that's known to the scores, or would we rather rely completely on the argument made in the grant?
So the RFP, which was communicated to the applicants for focus on rural, does reference one source of data. I think it's the one actually, Jim, that you were just talking about. So in the RFP, it says focus on rural. Applicants should describe any focus on rural communities. The California Commission on Access to Justice, I think this is what the report you were just citing,
right,
recommends defining rural as areas that meet the medical service study area standard for rural or frontier. The California Office of Statewide Health Planning and Development identifies those as sub-county clusters, and it goes on, and then it references, it cites, it links to hyperlinks to a chart. And essentially goes on to explain like rural MSAs have 50,000 or fewer residents, population densities below 250. And I want to say the report also has a map of California that shades the counties along the rural, urban, rural, urban. So I think this study you were just talking about was provided in the materials. Yeah, Danielle, correct me if any of that was wrong. Oh no,
it's not. I was changing changing topics slightly. So please continue.
So the committee could decide that it does or doesn't want to take that into account, but it wouldn't be something that was like withheld from the applicants. It's like a secret factor.
So if I could respond to Jim's comment, I don't view this like a jury trial, Jim, where you can only decide the case based on the evidence that's been presented to the jury or something like that. I mean, we always take into account some outside data, like on organizational capacity, for example. If the project has a history of compliance issues, that's going to be a problem. We'll take that into account.
okay.
And that was the point actually that I wanted to make. So thank you. In looking at the RFP language, we do say explicitly for organizational capacity, a sentence in that explainer paragraph says an applicant's history of meeting the goals and complying with the requirements of other grants is relevant to this criterion. So we do explicitly say that for that criteria. I don't think that same language is necessarily on other criteria, but again, as Chris mentioned, we do reference the MSSAs and the findings of the Access Commission.
Well, I'll take Eric's comments to heart that it's okay that we can bring in some of this other information. And that would leave us to focus on underserved, which my reading of the data there is that the group was pretty much in agreement, almost all of that, with the exception where we got some extreme variation was again in the Immigration Legal Resource Center, where we had people scoring 5s and we had people scoring 15s. I mean, I scored it as a 10 because I thought it meets because of the focus on domestic violence survivors. I thought that was one of the category of, that is a group that's well known to be problematic in terms of homeless, but that's just me having meat. How about some of the people that said exceeds? Was it because of the vulnerability of that group, or was it something else that gave it a 15?
Immigrant victims of domestic violence seem like a pretty well-defined, unique group to me. So
I had the same view, well-defined and particularly underserved in my view, and as I thought was articulated.
And Kim, is there a reason for a 5?
You know, I'm just gonna acknowledge that my whole scoring on this one was really based on my overall problem with it just not, I mean, you know, you read the introduction. There's not a word there about housing. So as far as I'm concerned, I'm very comfortable with you like lining my score out on this entire one. I have no you know, humility on this, but that, you know, I think I've pretty much stated my view on this. It's just, it requires too much of a leap of faith for anybody probably outside of this community, you know, being able to understand how this fits within a homeless grant.
Okay.
So you can discount me. Don't even consider me an outlier. But I stand by all my other scores.
Okay, all right. Well, that would lead us to project evaluation. And again, there's not a whole lot of variability except for the Family Violence Law Center. We have a lot of people coming in at 10s, but we have 2 people coming in, 1 person coming in as 0, and 1 is a 5. So, I mean, generally what I was looking for, I mean, for me to get a 15, you have to have it not only a good evaluation plan, but you also needed to budget it. And you need to be talking about numbers more than just case management data. But if they were just talking about yearly evaluations and case management data, that seems to be the norm. And for me, that's why I would give it a 10. But is there a reason why we, maybe Christian, if you could tell us why it was a 5?
I guess I'm not sure how consistent I was on this, but I think I was pretty consistent. Let me just double check. Yeah, as a general matter, I felt like we're going to review our cases was not very good as an evaluative measure. And don't you do that anyway? Like, I mean, God help us if people aren't doing that.
Right.
So, you know, I gave everybody pretty low scores in this category because I just didn't feel like there was sort of a, I don't know, like anything more to evaluate the effectiveness of the spending of this money. And, you know, to the extent that this is undertaking like a new project, it just feels like we should be able to do more than just to read what we did. So that's sort of my overall thinking. I think in the one, I gave a 15 to the justice and aging on this category. And it might be instructive for me just to sort of consider why I did that. But I'm going to need a minute to sort of just look at that real quick. But my recollection is that the reason why I did was because I liked their, shoot, that's the evaluation. I need a minute to pull it back up.
Well, on I scored that as meets because my notes said, well, they're going to track their trainings. if to the extent that they advocate and implement new policies, that they say they're going to review them after 6 months for effectiveness, but they didn't elaborate at all on how they were going to determine that effectiveness. Since they didn't do that, that's why I gave it a meets.
One thing that came up when staff was discussing family violence law centers evaluation is, and some of the other ones too, is there was a handful of the proposals where what they described was basically just, they described collecting the data that's required of them to collect. It is the communicated mandatory reporting, like you have to collect main benefits and outcome. Like they have no choice, they have to do that. And they described just collecting that data and quote, reviewing it. And then that was kind of like the limit of their evaluation. And we were like, okay, well, that's good that they're going to do the expected data collection and review, but they didn't go up beyond it. And we were discussing whether or not that was a below or a meets. I think where we landed on it was that it would probably be, we went meets, but that was something that staff pondered.
Yeah, I agree with everything you've all said. And I think it's a meets only because I think the general level of evaluation across all of these RFPs is pretty low. And that's kind of what it is, collecting the data they're supposed to collect and having maybe a meeting once a year. That just seems to be the standard, which is not terribly adequate, but to me, I guess it's a meets. But there was one project, I think CRLA actually talked about hiring an evaluator, actually.
Right, yeah. I thought that, yeah, year 2, second quarter. I was really, I thought that was really terrific. They said they were going to hire an outside evaluator to begin looking at the project.
But they didn't budget any money for it.
Yeah, they did.
They did?
It's budgeted in year 2.
Oh, it is? Okay.
My question was, why year 2? It would seem to me you'd want your evaluator in there in year 1 to tell you what data you need to collect to evaluate year 2. But I still gave them a 15 as exceeds because they were the only one that budgeted.
I read it as they were going to look at the first year data and then maybe do adjustments, but maybe I was reading too much into it. It seemed to make sense to me, but maybe we can suggest that to them, Jim.
Yeah. But I agree with Eric. They're the exception, not the rule.
From time to time, my Excel spreadsheet freezes, so I'll stop sharing my screen and reload it. That's all that's happening.
Just to follow up, I'm not wedded to downgrading, although I do think like consistency across this category seems easier to some extent, given that the only sort of distinguishing factor there was or the only distinguishing plan was CLRAs. So I don't know if other people have different opinions about that, but I'd say this seems like an area where we come to pretty broad agreement.
I agree. I don't really care whether it's a 10 or a 5, but I think it should be the same since we do seem to agree in substance.
Danielle, you had your hand up for a moment and then it went away.
Yes, because I was debating whether or not making the point, but I will since you called on me.
The floor is yours.
It sounds like the commission feels like, or the committee feels like a lot of these programs are kind of on the same level and it's just a matter of whether we're ranking them a 10 or a 5. My question would be, if we give the programs that are kind of doing the bare minimum or what is required of them for evaluation, and we score those as a 10 for meeting expectations, what, if anything, would be below expectations but not addressed? Which is, I recognize a theoretical question because I don't know that we have any in this set, but could you think of a situation where it would be appropriate for us to score something as a 5 in this category?
No evaluative effort, I guess.
We have seen that. It's not uncommon from what I recall from the last set. So
I view this as kind of an incremental process that my goal was to, or at least in my head, is to get the commission comfortable with the idea of using scoring rubrics and being consistent on that. And then the next level would be, okay, in the next round of grants, we actually put in the FRP that at a minimum, you're expected to request, you have to collect the following data as your reporting requirements require you to do. If you want to get meets expectations for evaluations, you have to do something above and beyond and explain why and what that will do for you. And so that we can actually gradually train the programs that our expectations on evaluations are going to gradually increase as we get more consistent with the scoring formulas for these grants. But that's a dream.
No, I think that's a nice aspiration. I like that.
For Danielle, like I just noticed that most people gave DRLC a below on evaluation. And so I pulled up what their response was, because that could be our example of like, well, what doesn't meet expectations. So their description, it's just identifying observable aspects of it. It's very short. I can even read it out loud because it's so short. It just says annual evaluations and reports on outcomes of the program process. Internal annual staff reviews of members of the program. And then the last one is feedback loop through all partners to provide assessments of the impact of DRLC's work. And that's it. That's like their evaluation plan. So that didn't get not addressed. You know, that wasn't like default so far below standards that it was like they skipped the question, but it was like most people gave it a below. So I don't know if that helps. So like lack of detail, maybe. Yeah.
Very generic response.
Like describing a very general plan to do some kind of evaluation, but not really like committing to anything in particular.
Yeah, I only gave it a meet expectations is because that's fairly typical of what we read. And so I'd be more than happy to downgrade them. Although I would mention, at least in their evaluation description, they include their partners and not systematic feedback to the partners, where a lot of the programs never even address that.
All right. So I'm putting in my notes for something for evaluation, like something that could be a meets is, it might be limited to what we just require them to collect, and that, the mandatory data collection and that they review it, that can still be a meets, but a below would be something like a particularly general description of like an intention to evaluate.
Hey, Chris, how many more of these projects are there?
We have 34 applications for competitive funding. So there are 29 other projects.
You better drink a lot of coffee.
Yeah, with the scoring team has set aside, because as a reminder, the committee decided to delegate it to the hybrid committee staff score team because of we only get 2 weeks to actually score them all and talk about them. So we've set aside, I think, 8 hours starting next week. There'll be like 4 2-hour meetings in a 2-week period. We have to get through all. We have to go back and rescore these 5 too, in light of today's meeting. And we'll score them ourselves, but then we're going to come together and we have to talk about every single one and try and come to a consensus on.
Right, and I'd like to point out to the committee that that's how today's process is going to be different than what the scoring committee does, because the scoring committee is going to take what we've discussed today and incorporate that in terms of how we apply the rubric. Then we're going to meet and try to reach consensus. Well, we were not trying to reach consensus today. We were trying to get the range of input today that's important to the committee. If we don't reach consensus, those are the grants and the areas that we're going to come back to the committee as a whole on, in order to see which way the committee wants to go in order to settle the consensus issue.
Have we budgeted enough time to get back to the committee and for the committee to have another one of these discussions before we actually have to make a recommendation to the commission as a whole? Or maybe we don't, right? I guess we don't have to make a recommendation to the commission as a whole. I guess it was delegated to this.
No, the RFP, we have to go back to the commission. We have an ad hoc commission meeting in December for the December commission meeting. We'll vote on the committee's recommendation. And then we have a pretty lengthy meeting. Chris, can you remind me what day it is for this committee to reach? I
think it's on December 13th.
Okay,
oh,
great.
For this committee. Oh, no, the committee meeting is on December 2nd, and it's a 3 or 4 hour meeting. I think it's 4. It might, so depending on how many areas of missing consensus that come out of the scoring team might decide whether or not staff tries to squeeze in a second committee meeting in like late November or something, if we don't think we can handle it in the 3 to 4 hour time container in early December.
Well, should we put something on the calendar just as a placeholder? If we don't need it, great, we'll cancel it, but just to get everybody booked, because that's a busy time of the year, obviously.
Sure. I think we did. I mean, the other option is, would you rather extend that really long meeting? It probably is going to be too long because 3 hours already on Zoom, maybe your max. Maybe we should just put a placeholder meeting, Chris, in November.
Okay.
And the December 2 meeting is scheduled for 4 hours already. So.
4 hours already. Yeah, that's pretty long.
Yeah. And I think the scoring team is optimistic that we will align on most of the categories for each of the proposals. So this is, you know, I think our goal is that we bring a reasonable number back to the committee. Yes.
Yeah.
Can I make one suggestion? This is for future RFPs, not for this one, but can we possibly shorten the application form? I just found reading this form to be so repetitive. Like I felt like I was reading the same thing, like, you know, 5 or 6 times. And it wasn't until I got to like the middle of the application that I got to the real numbers that I was interested in, like how many people are you going to impact and what are the outcomes going to be? So, I mean, can we come up with like a 2-pager, like a summary kind of thing that people?
I don't know if a 2-pager, but we could certainly revisit the format and the questions. And then if you're not getting the information that you need, we definitely should revise those questions.
Are you getting too much information, or is there like information missing?
Repetitive, like with the CRLA thing that Chris mentioned. You know, I just felt like I was going on and on about this county has this many homeless people, and I mean, like, just get over it. I know there's a lot of homeless people. I know that housing costs are high. What are you going to do about it? That's kind of what I want to know. And it took me like 5 pages into the application to kind of get to that.
We've put word counts, but maybe we could
Lower the word counts.
Yeah, and yeah. So definitely next time, I think we could take a closer look at the question and see how we can improve it.
You can always make improvements, so we will certainly look to figuring out how to do that.
Well, lowering the word limit is especially easy. It can cut them off after 5 sentences, you know, kind of thing. If we want to keep most of the questions, but there's probably a few questions in there.
Yeah.
That were like nice to haves, but not necessary. Dare we move on to special consideration now, Jim?
Sure, although I think we talked about it quite a bit already.
We did, yes. We started there. I wasn't sure if we came to like a good resolution as to how the scoring team ought to handle it. So it's like, for instance, I have as an open question in my notes, it sounded like the group was leaning towards giving more points if they would give the partner funding, as opposed to they would simply collaborate in some unfunded fashion. I don't hear anyone pushing back on it. That was what staff was leaning towards too. That felt right. Something else that had come up was the extent to which they detail the partner's work. So there would be the opportunity to give more points for being really specific about what the partners would be doing than giving the same number of points for a program that's kind of succinct about that. I don't hear any strong opinions, but I don't know, Eric, was it you? I can't remember who at the very beginning was concerned about sort of the lack of detail around what the partners would be doing.
I was, yeah.
I'm not sure that that's a special consideration. I mean, I view the partners' roles as related to just the project impact and strategies and or organizational capacity, but I don't think it's really a special consideration.
I agree with that.
I agree with that too. I just, you know, really wonder about this whole category, but I never liked it at all. But I don't really have any more comments on that. I mean, if we want to privilege partnerships, I guess that's fine.
Wait, so Kim and Dwan, the thing you just agreed about, I want to make sure I get it for my notes. Are you saying that partnerships shouldn't be for special consideration?
No, no,
That
partnership
way only in
is special
project impact, or?
consideration, but the specificness of it, the details
Yeah.
of it, like more in the project impact.
Yeah.
Okay.
So the existence of the partnerships is the special consideration, but the detail is in a different category.
Right.
And should there be any,
Strength of the proposal.
should there be any consideration of whether or not the partner is also state bar funded or not?
We didn't distinguish a staff between non-IOLTA and IOLTA funded, but if you would like us to.
Or I'm interested in what would be the arguments
Yeah,
for.
what's your thought about that? That they're better if they're state bar funded?
No, the only reason why it made a difference to me, and again, it could be contaminated because I was on the working group during the Appendix I review. And there was some people complaining that the organizations that don't qualify as qualified legal services providers, that they're always excluded from these funds. And whether or not partners, when you bring in partners, should extra consideration be given to those partners who are not state bar funded already. Like the ACLU, organizations like that normally don't qualify, but might qualify as a partner if they're doing special stuff in the area of homelessness. And again, that may be bringing in outside information that isn't necessarily relevant to what the commission wants to do on these grants.
I think it's safer not to distinguish.
Okay.
I also don't understand why you get more money or more points for having a state bar funded organization.
No, you got less. You got more points if they were not state bar funded, because that's spreading the funding around to more organizations.
Yeah, okay.
But I'm reading people as saying that should not be a factor.
Well, now that I understand what you were saying, I tended to the idea of partnerships and the novelty of particular partnerships increased my inclination to give extra points. But I wasn't basing it on state bar or non-state bar funding. For me, it was more, are you bringing in a strategic partner in a way that I thought was interesting or novel or whatever.
I have had a tendency of really favoring community organizations that were not necessarily IOLTA, or probably weren't IOLTA, because I felt that they were often very rooted in the community and had a very strengthening role on a project. But I think that it's very circumstantial, geographically. And so I feel that we shouldn't distinguish and limit, which organizations do you get additional points for.
But I think maybe Chris's approach in terms of like the strength of the partnership, enhancing the project or the service of delivery, I think that's good guidance for us.
So that's you could give more points for like it being a particularly well thought out interactive partnership. It's not just like, oh, they're going to do this thing, we're going to do this thing. And I guess that like aligns nicely, but they're actually going to be really collaborative and build something together. Okay. Great. Sorry.
What about the evidence-based advocacy? I mean, some of these guys merely said we're going to do more than brief advice and service or more service, and others actually full out said that they were going to go and litigate, which I think is what was meant by evidence-based advocacy. It's actual litigation, representation and litigation. Are there any strong feelings on that it has to be that specific?
I'll just say that the evidence is full representation, in most cases settle. So I don't know, I mean, I think, there's just in terms of what the data is that, you sort of have to be prepared to be able to litigate, but I don't know if that helps.
Does that evaluative factor exclude representation in administrative hearings where there's often a very favorable resolution for the client and it's faster and less costly?
I don't know is there in landlord tenant cases, is that an option?
Well, if it raises a fair housing question, it can go to DFVH.
Right, okay. Yeah, I don't know that we have data on that. I mean, I would think that would probably be, I wouldn't see an issue with it personally.
Okay.
I think what we have said, I mean, the data seems to say that, yeah, when people have representation and are, have that opportunity to be able to go through the tribunals, then they do better. I know it's really shocking, but at least it's evidence-based. There's random controlled trials, all that kind of stuff that the feds are looking for. But I think as an attorney, you figure out the best solution, right?
I actually didn't know what evidence-based advocacy meant. I thought it meant something much more highfalutin, like, you were employing some that's where I read in uniqueness. Now that I think about it, you're employing some great new strategy that was based on some study and evidence, and you were going to solve homelessness or make dents in homelessness by employing this great new strategy. You were just talking about handling litigation, basically. Handling contested proceedings. Is that what that means?
Yeah, but it's more than it. I mean, the data, it's what the federal government was asking for was what they call evidence-based practices. And their definition was a number of strong random control studies where some people similarly situated people got some kind of service and the other similarly situated people got a different kind of service. And you could tell that there was a benefit through providing the assistance. And we don't have a lot of that in legal services, as you can imagine. It's not a common thing where we say, oh, we're not really going to be able to help you. But there are 3 of those studies in landlord-tenant cases, and they do indicate that having full representation as compared to just advice and counsel is a more successful strategy.
Okay, but what that means as a practical matter is you're going to handle full litigation as opposed to just doing one advice session for somebody.
Yeah. Or I mean, in landlord-tenant, at least based on our Shriver research, there's a ton of cases, as I say, nearly all cases settle. They may well settle at the, day of court, but it's still that intervention of having an attorney that's providing full representation. I know it's a shocking finding, but.
So sorry, Bonnie, is it, I guess when I was reading it, I had full scope representation in my mind when I was reading it, but I didn't have litigation in my mind when I was reading the 5. So I was thinking that some of them weren't really litigation heavy, but they said, oh, we'll do full scope, like whatever comes up, we'll handle. Or maybe one of them was like, I can't remember, but yeah, but so in my head, I was like, okay, I think that checks that box. But do you think it really is more like representation before a judicial or administrative body, like in an adversarial process type thing, or that the studies, talk about, or is full scope just like, whatever comes up, we'll work on it. We won't limit the scope of our representation.
I would say it, as I said, because cases settled, I think the definition is full scope. The difficulty is we don't have that kind of data for some of these other case types for income maintenance and that kind of stuff. But I think full scope is a reasonable proxy here. I think that's what we know. Other things can be helpful, but.
Okay, so special consideration is actually pretty specific. category row of the rubric. It's either partners. It's almost like it's not binary by any means, but it's almost like they do or don't have partners. They do or don't offer full scope. But there's a little bit of wiggle room in there, maybe to like look at the depth of, is it a lot of full scope, or is that just like a tiny part of it? You know, is the partnership really robust, or is it just like there are partners and they're going to do a few things together? Well, we actually, I mean, we're doing so well on time. I don't know. I don't think we're gonna. This meeting was gonna go to 5. I don't think we have 2 hours left. I don't think we're gonna need that much more time. But since there is time, Jim, I don't know if you wanted to circle back on anything that was still an open question for you.
No, I think we've addressed everything. I think we should just open it up for any parting words of wisdom by any of the committee members and wrap it up.
You wanted robust chaos and you got it.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, Christian.
Yeah.
So, you know, Dwan and I had this conversation the first time around, and when we did this before, there was this idea that, you know, we were not going to be solving the homelessness crisis with more eviction defense. So I guess I'm just soliciting from staff and really anybody, like, you know, to the extent that we're advocates here and not neutral evaluators, what is the move here? Because, you know, I was frankly kind of disheartened to read an eviction defense application. And this is like, just to be super clear, this is not, you know, to denigrate that work in any way. I recognize how important it is, how oversubscribed the need is. So it has nothing to do with eviction defense generally or specifically to the particular program, but just as a systemic issue, we talked about this, like, it's not how we're going to be solving any problems by keeping one person, you know, from being evicted and doing UD cases. So I just would like to hear if anybody has sort of bigger picture thoughts on this, because I'm interested.
Yeah, last time we had at least one proposal that proposed some impact litigation that would be proactive to challenge, you know, kind of on a proactive basis, actions by landlords that threatened eviction, you know, maybe seeking injunctive relief and stuff like that. I didn't see anything like that here. I also didn't see any innovative use of technology in any of these proposals. So I don't know. Yeah, I agree with Chris. It didn't seem to be anything that earth-shaking here about these proposals. I mean, I wondered after reading them whether the legislature whether the state of California wouldn't have been better served by just putting all the money into the formula grants. Forget this RFP. I don't know, just my reaction.
Bonnie.
Well, I guess I want to talk about these funds are coming from COVID relief funds from the federal government, which are designed to deal with a really specific problem that I think many of us have been really concerned about the eviction tsunami, which is going to need, in my humble opinion, is really going to need representation. If you've had a chance to look at all the remedies, the forms, the idea that somebody is going to be able to navigate that system effectively without a lawyer is hard for me to imagine. And I'm a big proponent of self-help, as you know. So, I mean, I think it's partly what these funds were designed for with the feds and why, and they're saying they want it, you know, this evidence-based practice. And I think that, you know, California is trying to come up with lots of ways of addressing this. But I think that there may be a slightly different context, that this is COVID relief.
Dwan.
So I don't have a great response, Chris, to your question, but I will say that, you know, with starting with the HP1, we're collecting more robust data we're aggregating the data right now. We've been reviewing some of the preliminary data with Judicial Council and also with the help of Jim. We will be able to share something probably in a few months with this committee and the commission. And I think that we'll have a kind of a baseline of then in future years, what we're striving towards. The data is really interesting in that it breaks out by zip code, demographics. It's really, really robust and rich. And I think once we have the data in hand, perhaps, like you said, Chris, we're not just grant makers, we're trying to shape policy as well. If there are things that we can recommend based on the data, that's data driven, I think that's something that's tangible that staff and this commission can do and work towards.
And Christian, just my 2 bits as a sociologist, I would say the real problem is just a lack of affordable housing. If we could only increase a housing stock, especially in California, that we wouldn't have as much problems as we do today. However, we're given limited funds that are directed to a specific area by a specific organization. And so that's why we're kind of restricted to kind of like the legal response in terms of landlord evictions. And so that's only one small part of the problem. It doesn't address the entire problem.
Right, but I guess that's sort of, I mean, you're putting your finger on one concern that I have, which is that, I think that the way in which the legislature used the direction and the directive that was associated with this grant of money to the commission to make is sort of broader and more systemic. And my sort of grave concern, and I don't know that this will come to pass, so I don't want to, be in the prediction game here, but my grave concern is that the legislature concludes that that the community didn't respond in a meaningful way. Because, and obviously, and I've said this before, so I don't want to belabor the point, but $80 million is not going to solve the housing crisis. But so it's a sort of false premise to assume that, but I just don't want to put the legal services community into the crosshairs of the legislature with them saying, gosh, what did you do for us? And so I'm just worried about that, because what I hear Bonnie saying is, look, we've got to spend this money in a certain way. This eviction tsunami that's coming down the pike is real. And I totally agree with that. And I, share her view that it will require legal help for people to navigate that. But I am worried that, the specificity of that directive is not really that widely understood about how this money is going to get spent and how this funds really should be used. And I'm not quite where Eric is in terms of saying that this, maybe this should have all just been formula funding, because I hope springs eternal. And, the idea of an innovation coming out of this process is one that I still sort of hold on to. But, it doesn't feel like we're just helping people navigate the process to get eviction defense funds from the CARES Act.
Yeah,
So-
that's interesting.
So we have had this discussion before, and I agree with what everyone has said. I think there is, from my perspective, a gap between the legal services community and the affordable housing developers. I made some attempt by bringing in somebody from nonprofit housing organization when we did that first convening. I think there's just this big gap to connect the two, to do work beyond the eviction defense area. And I think, it's some of the larger legal services programs have community economic development units. But I strongly believe that what needs to happen is if this money is going to keep flowing in this direction, that we've got to make the linkages with the affordable housing developers. And we've got to get the backup centers to really focus on the housing policy work. And that's a complex process, but it's one, you know, it's these pieces that I think really, really need to connect, because the eviction defense work will always be there. And there is money for housing development, but it's, you know, it's coming to us to give to these programs that typically don't do that actual work. That's my perspective.
Christian raises a super interesting question about like the systemic solution to homelessness. So speaking only about the more narrow question of like, I wonder why there's a competitive grant, and maybe, you know, could the formula grants have achieved this? And the one thing that I think maybe is helpful with having the bifurcated grants is that the legislature obviously wrote into AB 164 that the competitive has to give preference to rural, whereas the formula obviously is not connected to that. So it is, my hope is that when we actually finish scoring, we'll actually see as a material amount going to rural California that maybe otherwise wouldn't have gone. But I mean, we don't know actually. We could then compare it to like what would have happened had it all been formula, but well, hopefully that will make a difference. And then the other thing is, obviously with the competitive, the smaller programs can dream up a really big budget request, whereas the formula, you know, it's tied to how much money they spend in the previous year. So they would have like a functional ceiling. So, but whether or not, you know, at the end of the day, when all the scores come in, it actually made that difference, I think is like, that's an actual question we can look back and answer. But I think that's the hope, is it'll help those programs. Well, we're well ahead of time. Yeah, so any other thoughts, even if it's about the scoring rubric? Okay, well, I'll report that I pulled a couple of really quick stats on the applicant. It's very, very few, but on the applicant pool, normally staff would give you the presentation on like, here's all the applications we got, and here's all the counties that would be funded, and show you the map and everything. So you'll still get that in late November, early December. But just up front, you know, there are 34 applications for competitive funding. The total amount of funding available after admin fees is $19,500,000, and that's tied to the expected $80 million over 3 years of appropriations, $19,500,000. So the total ask from all 34 applications combined is $33,750,000 ish. The average request is just shy of $1 million. These are for 3-year budgets. The committee had set a budget ceiling of $1,500,000. So the average was just under $1 million. It was $992,600. So yeah, $33,750,000 total, $19,500,000 available. If everyone got their, if everyone got about $1 million, it would be enough for 20 or so of the 34 programs to receive funding. 29 qualified legal services projects applied out of 34, 5 support centers. 23 of them would focus on rural, meaning they just answered the question, will you focus on rural? They said yes. The other 11 said no. Everyone said they would serve underserved communities, unsurprisingly, but that was a yes or no question. And it was defined as like, is there any aspect other than income that you can articulate that you'll target that community? So everyone was able to identify at least one other aspect, be them victims of domestic violence, or they're undocumented, or mental health issues, which I would like to think, and the legislature had put in the statute, you know, must give preference for rural, must give preference for underserved. I would like to think maybe at least some programs more narrowly focused their proposal and sought out some extra feature of underserved because this was in the rubric and because it was in the statute, and therefore it kind of nudged them in that direction. But at the December meeting, we'll give you a full picture of everyone who applied and what counties, and then, you know, how it breaks down with the scores. But just to give you that heads up. So the scoring team, which is staff members Dwan Nguyen, Daniel McRae, and myself, and then Jim Meeker is committee chair. is going to meet, that we've scheduled 4 2-hour-ish meetings over the next couple of weeks, so that we can finish discussing all proposals and finish scoring for ourselves, I think, mid-November. And we'll certainly know by then if the committee needs to meet again between November 15th and December 2nd, or if we can just use that time on November 2nd to resolve any outstanding questions.
Well, thanks to all of you for the time you're going to put in and the time you put in already on this. I mean, it's really a lot of work. It's hard enough to read the 5 of them, much less the remaining 30 or so. I mean, so.
We have to go back and rescore them because we have to do it with start.
I was actually a little relieved to know that. So yes, staff, thank you very much, because it took me quite some time to get through 5 of them. So certainly appreciate the work that you guys do behind the scenes.
Tammy, you just have to write like a 15-page memo of your experience.
That's right. Yeah, the policy requires that we document the recommendation in a memo. So there'll also be a memo in there.
It just takes another 10 or 12 hours.
No, we're looking forward to it. We're super excited. So Danielle, Dwan, Jim.
Thank you for the meeting today. The additional guidance is really, really helpful for us. We had so many pending questions, and I just want to especially thank Jim. He's not only part of this review team, but he's been helping us analyze the HP data as well as the EF data. And we're really excited to share that to you in the next couple months. So thank you so much, Jim.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and actually that's a great point. This was, I kind of started the meeting with like, what does success look like? Like we achieved that, which was that the scoring team got really, really robust, sleeves rolled up, quote unquote, guidance from the full committee on how to apply the rubric going forward. So that was a smashing success in my head. So hope everyone feels that way. All right, Jim, we can adjourn if you would like.
Yeah, and again, when this is all done, we need to go through a debriefing session, since we've tried it splitting amongst the committee as opposed to this particular approach, to see which way we should go in the future, which is a better way.
Well, by the way, we're heading, we'll see what happens, but we're heading toward doing more or less the same thing for the Partnership Grants Committee. We'll see what the committee wants to do, but that's sort of the initial thought that at least I have as the chair with staff. So we'll look to you as leaders.
Well, we'll have to compare the spreadsheets between the two committees to see who's got more agreement.
That's good. Yeah. Great.
Thanks.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody.
Have everyone. Have a great weekend.
Enjoy the hour and a half you just got back.
Thank you.
Have a great weekend.